Welcome to Torn, the only podcast committed to exposing the truth about the child welfare system and its devastating impact on families of color, told from the perspective of your hosts, Sonia Johnson and Classie Colinet, two defense attorneys who have over 15 years of experience working in the child welfare system.
Today, we are fortunate enough to have two powerhouses in the child welfare fight for justice, Toni Oliver and Leora Neal, who are both social workers affiliated with the National Association for Black Social Workers. At this time, could you, Ms. Neal and Ms. Oliver, introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about the National Association?
Hi, I'm Toni Oliver, and I was just doing subtraction. I have been in the field of child welfare. Well, let me say I've been a member of NABSW for over 40 years. And during that time, in addition to being a member, I've also been a chairperson or a co-chairperson, depending on the administration, of committees that are related to foster care, adoption, kinship care, and permanency planning. I was the 12th national president of NABSW and the 11th vice president, national president of NABSW. And during the time that I was actively involved in the profession, I started and ran a Black adoption agency for 18 years in Atlanta.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for that. Ms. Neal, would you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Leora Neal. I've also been in child welfare for, I guess, over 50 years now, And I also was a co-chairperson on the child welfare committees that was sponsored by the National Association of Black Social Workers for many years. And also I was the founder and first executive director of the ABSW Adoption Service in New York City. And I'm acting director at the present time. And the purpose of that agency was to dispel the myth that Black families do not adopt. And we've been very successful for the last 45 years in placing Black children with Black families.
Wow, that is awesome. Thank you for that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the national organization and how you became a part of that organization?
Okay, the National Association of Black Social Workers began in 1968. It came out of a situation where there were African-American social workers attending the National Conference of Social Welfare, which is what at that time was a very prominent, child welfare organization. But the African-American social workers who were in attendance felt that the information, the topics that were being discussed were not relevant to the Black communities. And the organization that was giving the conference was not willing to modify anything. So social workers in attendance walked out and met together, and they decided to start the National Association of Black Social Workers. So May 29, 1968, so, is the starting point of the national. But it should be also noted that there was an Association of Black Social Workers agency in New York City that began in 1967.
Wow.
And so that organization also became an affiliate of the National Association of Black Social Workers. And that's how the thing for social work began.
Can you discuss perhaps a little bit about the role that social workers play within the context of child welfare?
Social workers play many roles. They're direct social workers or caseworkers for families and children in the system. They also may be in policy-making positions at times, and so forth and so on. It's a lot of different areas that they work in. Primarily, I guess most of them would be working direct service, but there are also people, of course, in administrative positions and also policy-making positions too, with the government and so forth to, work on those laws and policies that the agencies have. So it's a variety of things.
I just want to go back to the family preservation work that your organization has been doing. Can you speak to that? Because I think that really is important, and that's getting at what you were talking about in terms of the role that social workers should be playing, and particularly Black and Brown social workers. So if you can just address the family preservation work that your national organization has been doing, and the work specifically that you've been doing as well.
Yeah, from the 70s, the organization has done research and presented papers and written pamphlets and other documents that support our position that children should be placed with family members. So family preservation is, in fact, preserving families and not destroying them and not tearing them apart in the way that the child welfare system does when children are removed from their families. That removing children from families causes the most harm. And the child welfare system looks at removing families and placing them with families who supposedly can take care of them better, which in fact, our organization has looked at the fact that there is perhaps more abuse and neglect in foster families and in treatment homes and residential treatment centers than there is in birth families where the children were removed. And not only that, when children are not placed with a permanent family once they've gone into foster care, when they exit foster care, they go back to those same homes that they were removed from.
The organization has always, our thrust has been family preservation, as Toni said. And so, the organization had set up committees and task force to work on that, to try to change the systems in the various states that our membership comes from, because we have members throughout the United States and also in various parts of the world, in Nassau, Bahamas, in South Africa, and in London, England as well. So our thrust has always been trying to keep families together, because since slavery times, as you know, the Black families have always been torn apart, parents and children torn apart, husbands and wives. And oftentimes in the child welfare system, because of the negative concepts that the powers that be see toward Black families, that they assume that the Black family cannot function. They assume that the Black family cannot take care of its children, and that's not true, or not interested and what have you. And so our thrust has always been to talk about the strengths that the families present, and to try to get organizations and lawyers, judges, etc., to not look like a family by the problems they may present, but what are their strengths, and what can we do to build on those strengths. And that's what we've been pushing for, and writing papers, serving on task force and commissions throughout the nation. And finally, seemingly currently, there is a thrust now for family first, placing children with relatives. If the child has to be, first of all, if something comes up and the family is, CPS is called on the family, Child Protection Services is called on the family, first thrust should be to see, can you keep that child with that birth family through services and what have you. And so the child does not have to come into foster care. If it's diagnosed that this child should be removed, then what other relatives are available right now? Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and even people, this terminology they may have called fictive kin, which means people like godparents and other family friends that the child is familiar with, to see if some of them, one of them can take the child. So only those children that those possibilities are not available would come into foster care. And so you've seen in some states, I can only speak for New York State because it's where I am right now. In New York, for example, there's a big thrust for family first, and look for extended family members to take children. And so the numbers of children in foster care has dropped dramatically. It used to be a time that in New York City alone, back in the 70s and 80s, you had 20 to 30,000 kids in foster care. Now in New York City, it's down to 8,000, and statewide is 15,000. That's a tremendous drop. And the state is working toward, training, setting up a whole new training system for workers from the line staff up into the administration, to have a new way of thinking about how to work with families and how to do things differently. So fewer numbers of children would come into care to stay with their families, because that's, as was brought out by Toni, most of the kids, when they come out of care and they have no place to go, they try to look up their birth families anyway. And so it's been better if they could have stayed with them from the beginning and not going through all that trauma.
So
Right.
I know, just wanted to tag that by saying that your work has had an impact. In New Jersey, we are very focused on family first. And just as you said, that the focus now is making sure that kids are placed with family and kin. We just had, back in, I think it was July of 2021 or 2022, KLG legislation passed, and the focus was to make kin placement the ideal placement as opposed to non-relative placement. So you've had an impact, and our hope is that we can see more family first kin placement take place across the country within the context of child welfare.
Miss Oliver, if you could tell us a little bit about the National Association of Black Social Workers' position on transracial adoptions. And for our listeners, just want to quickly explain what transracial adoption is. So transracial adoption is when a child of one specific racial or ethnic group is then adopted by a family that is of a different racial or ethnic group.
1972 was the first time NABSW did a written statement on transracial adoption. And the statement was that we believed that Black children needed to be placed in Black families. The reason for that is because when Black children were coming into foster care and became eligible for adoption, Black families who were seeking to become adoptive parents were being screened out for arbitrary criteria that did not make sense. And particularly if there was a white family who was interested in the same child, the standards that were used to approve the family were white middle-class standards. And anything that the Black family brought in, even when they were professional families, there was just a kind of picking away, nitpicking of what is wrong with this family that would make them less qualified to be an adoptive parent than this white family who wants to be placed. And so transracial adoption became a big thing in the child welfare system. And white families were coming in and looking predominantly for younger, healthy children. They were being selected over Black families. And if Black families were selected for a child, they were typically older and they had special needs. And I certainly know in the 90s, when I started my agency, that we had a waiting list of Black families to adopt, and they were being not selected because white families were being considered before them. So the position of NABSW as an organization that advocates for justice and the rights of Black families and children in any social welfare arena was that we stood as advocates for African-American families who wanted to adopt, that they would be considered, and that there would be, actually in the beginning, an elimination of white families in consideration for the adoption of Black children. The reason that we did that is because we wanted to look to the fact that there were African-American families who were eligible to adopt, who could adopt, and who were successful at adoption. And that discussion was not entertained in the child welfare community as long as there were white families who said that they wanted to adopt. Later came legislation, Multi-Ethnic Placement Act and the Inter-Ethnic Placement Act, that said that decisions for placement could not be made based on race. Because what happened, based on our advocacy for Black families, is that if a Black child became available for adoption, or a sibling group of Black children became available for adoption, and there was a Black family who was interested, agencies were selecting the Black family to maintain the racial continuity. White families were saying they were being discriminated against. And so they advocated for legislation that was passed that basically said you could not use race as a factor in making that decision. Now, actually, what happened is that agencies began to get very, very squeamish because the legislation also said if there is discrimination against white families in the adoption of a Black child, you can lose your federal funds. So even till today, agencies are very reluctant, and reluctant is soft, to choose a Black family over a white family because they're afraid that they will lose their federal funds if they select a Black family and the white family says, I was discriminated against.
Yeah, I would like to jump in and say, point out, going back to the beginning, that the reason why the idea of transracial adoption came about in the first place is because of the shortage of white infants. And adoption up until, I guess, unfortunately, up until maybe 70s or 80s was seen as a service to families instead of a service to children. But our organization feels that adoptions should be a service to the child, not to the parent. But, in those days, and sometimes some agencies still today, when it comes to white families, they see it as a service to the family. The families that were asking to adopt Black children, they were not asking to adopt the majority of the children who were in care, which were older to school-age children, children, sibling groups, and children with special needs. They were looking for healthy babies. And that's to accommodate that, because, as I say, there was a shortage, and there's still a shortage. It's very difficult to get a white infant, very difficult now. And so they started placing children who were initially considered to be biracial children. In the United States, they're still considered Black, but the biracial child was considered first to be placed with white families. And then later on, they would started placing children who had two Black birth parents. And it was to accommodate that need. As I say, the majority of the kids in care who were older kids were still not being adopted by white families. So I just want to make that clear. It was only later on when some white families may have had children in their home as foster children and maybe fell in love with a particular child who was older, that they asked to adopt those kids. But prior to that, the majority, when you're talking about the late 60s and early 70s, when transracial adoption was going very strongly, it was about infants and toddlers at the oldest of children to fill that need for all these families who were waiting, white families waiting for babies to adopt. And the organization was concerned about what about the Black child who was adopted into a white family, most of the families lived in all white areas, which most of them still do. How are they going to learn about their culture, their African-American culture? How are they going to learn how to deal with racism? Because it doesn't matter whether you're in a Black family or a white family, you're going to experience racism once you leave the door of your house. And no matter how much love you get in the family that you're living with, you have to be prepared to face the world when you go outside those doors. And so that's what we've concerned. We felt that families of Black families who they themselves have already experienced racism and had know how to deal with it would be the best people to work with Black children who would be adopted, to help them to understand what they're dealing with. Because children sometimes feel something's wrong with them if they're getting all these slings and arrows coming toward them, and no one's putting it in the social context about this happens to all Black people. It's not something wrong with you personally. So we want to make sure that the children developed positive self-esteem, and we felt that could best be done in a Black family setting. It was not our position was not based on any racial hatred, because sometimes we've been accused of that. It was not racial hatred, nor did we think that white families couldn't love Black children. That was not the issue. The issue was what was best for that child in the long run, help them to be a functioning person who is not confused and feel isolated from the world. Because the adoptees will tell you themselves, those who are grown now, writing their own books, doing their own videos, is that on the one hand, they don't know sometimes until they make an effort of themselves as they get older to make that connection with the African-American community. They don't feel they fit there. And then on the other hand, the white community does not accept them either. So they're sort of like marginalized in the middle, like, where do I fit? So those are the issues that we were concerned about.
I'm glad you talked about that or mentioned that. I don't know if you saw, I think last year, Colin Kaepernick's story was produced and released, and he talked about, or at least the story depicted some of the issues that you just talked about, being loved by a white mother and father, but their inability to kind of understand what it means to be Black in this country and how to navigate those issues. And so the importance of placing Black children in a Black family, speaking to those issues and speaking to how do you address and how do you raise a positive self-identified Black child in this country. So can either you, Ms. Oliver or Ms. Neal, speak to the importance, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit already, of creating positive self-identity, particularly for Black children in this country?
Well, first of all, you're going to do, as I say, in 1994, NABSW came out with a family preservation position paper saying that we felt that transracial adoption should be a last resort after you've tried to keep the child with their birth family, or if that's not possible, place them in adoption with a same race, in race placement. And if that was not possible, then transracial adoption would be the third option. But so if a family is going to adopt transracially, first of all, they should have friends and associates, in the African American community, Black friends, for example. There were some families adopted never had a Black friend, or anyone to really tell them, what it's like to be, to be a Black person in America, what that really was like, because they haven't really experienced that. And most of them lived in white neighborhoods, where you didn't see other people. A child wouldn't see anyone that looked like them. And sometimes even their extended family may reject that child too, because of the child was Black. So it's very important that they live in integrated neighborhoods. It's important that they have friends and associates. That is a natural part of their life, that would be in and out of their house and so forth, that the child would see. It was important that they learn about Black history and culture, and so that they could inform the child of that and have, books and videos and all those kind of things in the house to help the child with their racial identity. It's important that they have someone to help to speak to the issues of racism and how do you deal with that on a daily basis and still keep your sanity, and also, learn how to cope with it and deal with it on various levels. So all those kinds of things they need to learn about beforehand. And when they passed those multi-ethnic placement, interethnic placement acts, it was not mandatory that the prospective families get training in transracial and transcultural issues. Some agencies did it on their own because they knew it was important, but it was not mandatory. So a lot of families that got into the situation, they had no idea. They thought that love was all you needed. They had no idea what they were going to face, and they were no longer seen as a white family anymore. They were seen as a mixed family, and some people looked down on them because of that. They weren't expecting that to happen. So it's a lot of things that they need to learn and do to be prepared for that kind of placement, for their children's sake, for their own sakes, and all those kinds of things. And so we feel that, as I said before, it's best for a child to be in same race placement, but if that's not possible, at least prepare the families for what to expect and help them to work with those children as to what to expect. Even things like, one big issue that always comes up when you have conferences for transracial adopted families, how to comb the children's hair, the whole hair and skincare thing. When you have a conference like that, a workshop, the line is out the door, because trying to learn how do you do with the hair, how you do with the skin, all these kinds of things that they had no idea was going to be an issue when they adopted. So it's a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration to prepare the family and help the children, and especially get them involved with people, that other positive Black people, organizations and other Black children, so they don't feel that they're a strange thing in the world.
There's so much to this. I mean, I'm listening and I have a range of emotions based on the years of experience that I've had with families who have adopted transracially, the kinds of questions that they've asked me, the observations that I've made in terms of how they perceive their children and their children's ability. I was thinking, Sonia, when you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, how his family was able to identify with the actually racist statements that his sports coaches would make to him, because they could see that what the coaches were saying in terms of their perception of what made a acceptable Black person made sense to them, but it was hurtful to him. You know, they wanted him to change his hair because it was uncomfortable for them to look at hair that was not straight and short and laid down. Things that he saw that he thought were examples of who he wanted to be and how he wanted to look based on the kinds of Black people he was seeing in the media were not things that were acceptable in his own family. And so these families feel as though they're doing what is right for their child, and they have no racial, the families, the adults have no racial orientation, no racial or cultural orientation. Their standards are white, and what they believe that they can best do for their child is to make them, provide them an environment where they can see what the benefits are of being white, if you want to say acting white, thinking white, walking white, dressing white, are, and that will make them a better Black person. What happens is that these young people get out into the world as young adults and they're very confused, because the things that they've been told would make them acceptable don't make them acceptable when they're not with their family. And as a matter of fact, they haven't been acceptable when they were with their family, because there were white family members who didn't accept them. There were white students that they went to school with who didn't accept them. They've been called names, some of which they have shared with their families. Oftentimes they have not shared with their families, that are all related to the fact that they are not white. Yet our system, our child welfare system, says we have placed these children in better families. And when you say better, and you have a white family and a Black family, and that white family was better, what does that say to the child? And also, what does it say to the family? Because many of these families then feel as though they're better than wherever the child came from, better than the people who look like the child, regardless of whether they're professional or not professional, whether they live in middle-class communities or low-income communities. And so the child is dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, I talk about an example of a child who was adopted, a young Black boy who was adopted by a white family when I was working with a adoption agency in Philadelphia. And that dad wanted to adopt again. And so they came into the office and they were looking through photo listing books to select a child because of a picture and a description that they would want to join their family. The young boy looked at these pictures and at one point looked at his white dad and he said, "I wish I was white." And his dad appropriately said, "You are good for who you are." And the boy looked at his father and he said, "That's easy for you to say." That spoke volumes to me, and it really hurt my heart, because I don't know that his father could understand what he was saying. If you're white and you can say it doesn't matter, you don't have to be white. But if you're Black, and I'm having the experience of being singled out for various things about my Blackness, whether it's the color of my skin, whether it's the texture of my hair, I'm not going to say, I see that it's better to be white, because if I were white, I wouldn't be getting this kind of reaction and this kind of treatment. So white families who adopt Black children oftentimes miss that. They miss what's going on with their children, because oftentimes the children don't say it to them, or if they say it to them, they give them a response that negates the importance of race and culture. in that child's life.
The opinions and views expressed on this podcast are those of its hosts and guests and represent our own lived experience. The views and opinions expressed do not reflect those of any agency or organization with which we may be associated.